So Jinsa put out a propaganda video here, so I want to debunk it point by point. I'm gonna go really quickly, so you don't have to worry about it taking too long. Uh, Regarding how much aid Israel allows to be transferred into Gaza, the video never mentions how much aid is actually needed for the 1.5 million Palestinians that are living in Gaza, that most Palestinians need or use smuggling to get food, and the list of items barred from Gaza by Israel has been published by The Economist and isn't just weapons. Israeli leaders have called the Gaza blockade an effort to put Palestinians on a diet, as the blockade has included barring things like meats, musical instruments, um, school supplies, basic spices, chocolate, etc. The United Nations has also weighed in and found that what little aid passes through into Gaza is completely insufficient. The photos of Palestinian life in Gaza are probably prior to the imposition of the blockade and after the Gaza pullout. Secondly, Hamas was elected rather than violently placed into power. Thirdly, regarding prevention of rocket attacks, when Hamas and Israel agreed to a ceasefire in 2008, by all accounts, including Israel's, it was Hamas that kept to the ceasefire and was willing to renew it, while Israel broke the ceasefire multiple times by raiding Gaza and by refusing to lift its blockade. This culminated in the 2008 through 2009 Gaza siege that involved Israel intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure and costing billions of dollars in damage, making aid to Gaza a greater priority than it already was. And that's according to every major human rights group and independent NGO that weighed in, including the United Nations. Regarding the aim to become martyrs of some of the activists, clearly Israel did that for them. Regarding the legality of the blockade, all international legal institutions have weighed in that the blockade is illegal, specifically because Israel still controls the borders, airspace, and sea space of Gaza, meaning Gaza is not an independent state, but rather still an occupied territory, and hence using a blockade against them is an illegal tactic. Uh, 6. Regarding Israeli claims that the aid would be transferred to the Gazans if the activists simply handed it over, these were unreliable promises due to the fact that Israel itself is responsible for the blockade. This refusal to cooperate with the blockade assumes that Israel allows aid into Gaza, which clearly the aid it gives is insufficient according to every international legal institution. Regarding footage of activists asking Israelis to go back to Auschwitz, Israel itself has redacted this claim and instead put out an alternate version of the same exchange in which the activists simply deny Israel's request to dock. Furthermore, grainy voices of unseen activists are not reliable or trustworthy in terms of being a claim for anything and border on conspiracism. And in any case, saying offensive things is not the same as doing offensive things. Rather than the Turks being mercenaries or terrorists, the Gaza Flotilla included numerous dignitaries and prominent individuals, including former U.S. State Department officials, ambassadors, Nobel laureates, a Holocaust survivor, various European Parliament members, and an Israeli Minister of the Knesset member, making it virtually impossible that the Mavi Marmara was a terrorist cell. The IHH, the Turkish charity in question, has UN status and is a respected international charity, and it is not on the U.S. State Department's list of terrorist organizations, and no real or substantial proof beyond a single French intelligence officer's accusations have ever been put forward as any sort of proof that the IHH is a terrorist group. Regarding attacks on soldiers, the autopsy reports of the 9 dead activists revealed gunshot wounds in the head and upper body of the activists from close range, 2 to 14 centimeters, suggesting Israelis were not shooting in self-defense but rather executing people. Coupled with eyewitness claims that Israelis were shooting people in their beds, it is clear that on the Mavi Marmara there was cause for alarm amongst activists, and they assumed the right to defend their persons and their boats, as is their legal and human right. According to eyewitnesses and limited footage that was smuggled out, Israel had already begun shooting at the passengers on the Mavi Marmara before raiding the boat and possibly having killed a man, meaning passengers on the boat were afraid for their lives and assumed the right to defend their persons and their boat. All objects shown and used in the video footage that were described as weapons were indeed random objects that could be found on any ship: kitchen knives, sticks, deck chairs. Any other weapons, such as guns and stun grenades, were probably confiscated from the Israeli soldiers that raided the ship, and claims that they were used on the Israeli soldiers, as opposed to the Israeli soldiers using them on sleeping passengers, remain unsubstantiated. Claims that the defensive attacks on raiding soldiers were premeditated are unsubstantiated. The only Um, Real proof is subtitles that were placed in the video by Israeli editors that suggest that they're cutting up the ship for the sole purpose of attacking Israeli soldiers, when in reality there's no evidence for that. Uh, Additionally, under international law, raiding a ship in international waters to enforce an illegal blockade is an act of war against the nation of the ship, which in this case was Turkey. After the raid and the arrest of the activists, many activists were beaten and tortured in custody. After the raid, confiscated personal property, including credit cards, were used by the Israeli soldiers. That's credit cards of the activists. As the video admits, Israel has released hundreds of propaganda videos based on the heavy editing and confiscation of footage from the activists, something that has been rightfully condemned by the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. Jinsa is a radical pro-Israel Zionist group whose policy advocacy is based on aiming for regime change in multiple Middle Eastern nations, including pushing for the current bloodletting in Iraq. It is a far right-wing Zionist group, and it is therefore extremist in outlook and unreliable for an objective account of the Gaza Flotilla attack. Additionally to that, one of the slain activists, Furkan Dogan, was indeed an American citizen. He was shot 4 times in the head and 1 time in the chest at close range. I think when pro-Israel advocacy groups like Jinsa suggest that Israeli soldiers were defending themselves after they raid a boat in international waters, shoot at the activists from the helicopters, board the ship, and begin shooting people at close range in the head, and then say, oh my God, they picked up knives or deck chairs or whatever they could find to defend themselves, I think that suggests that pro-Israel groups have forgotten what legitimate self-defense looks like. They've spent so much time trying to portray Israel as defending itself when it attacks Palestinians in Gaza, when it blockades them, when it goes to war with God knows who, they've redefined self-defense in Israel's favor for so long that they don't understand what actual self-defense looks like. Actual self-defense is what those activists were attempting to do to prevent their deaths. And unfortunately, for some activists, that was not enough. They were shot at close range in the head, and they were essentially martyred. That's all that needs to be said.